not, the language that's in the K-12 legislation is not exactly as Representative Reiner introduced it, and that suggests somehow along the way things happen so that no one is complete master of any idea. These ideas are a function of compromise, and so there are things that people, I suspect, like in that proposal depending upon their perspective, and things that people don't like depending on their perspective. But the bill that Representative Reiner introduced was part of something the governor seemed to support, something that Education Minnesota had looked at, but it is not the bill that the final language is not exactly as Representative Reiner introduced it, and there are pieces that the original advocates probably don't like. A second important provision had to do with the early literacy program. This amended an existing section of law. It's something that Senator Jen Olson, who is the chair of the Senate K-12 Education, Finance, and Policy Chair, for want of a better word, owns. She is very invested in this particular provision. She has worked very hard on early reading. This is a modification of an existing law. There are provisions related to parent notification, requirement for early literacy plans, monitoring of K-3 students' reading proficiency. And this all goes to the point that children who are not able to read by grade 3 are at a tremendous disadvantage, and the prospects for them later on are not good. Then Valerie touched on this too. Another change was the prospective repeal of integration revenue. There is a 12-member task force that is charged with making recommendations for repurposing the revenue. The language, in my opinion, on that, and actually I wouldn't mind reading it to you just to make the point. The list that you have has pages on it, and the pages correspond more or less to the bill. But there was language added very late in this process, and Valerie is right. I think the bill was posted for the public about 1:30 in the morning and passed about 2:30 or so on the floor. But there's a paragraph B which appeared late in the process. It says, and I'll read it to you if I may, the funding allocation for the new program, this is the program that would replace integration revenue, should ensure funding stability for districts between the current integration program and the new program. I don't know what funding stability actually means, but there it is. The money shall be used for the purposes recommended and forwarded by the task force. Well, first of all, this is an advisory task force, so I don't know how binding it is, and approved and appropriated by the legislature. Well, the legislature can work its will, and whether it agrees or disagrees with the advisory task force remains to be seen. So what the function of this paragraph B is with respect to integration revenue, it's hard to tell. Valerie also mentioned the repeal of the January 15th deadline and the state aid penalty that comes with it for collective bargaining agreements. And although I said I list 4, perhaps if you let me, I'll list one more. It's the tiered teacher licensure provisions. It was a bill that Representative Kapp in the House originally offered. When the Reiner bill for teacher evaluation was on the floor, it was Representative Kapp who offered up the provision, and he included this tiered teacher licensure language too. There is a task force that is charged with developing recommendations for the Board of Teaching to structure a tiered licensure program. It's part of something called TAP, which is the Teacher Advancement Program. I believe both the Department of Education and the Board of Teaching have been working on that. And if I fail to say that along with teacher evaluation, there's also principal evaluation, let me do that now. The principal evaluation goes into effect first. That would be 2013-2014, the teacher evaluation in 2014-2015. And one last point, it's set up a little bit like unrequested leave of absence in the sense that the union and the board are able to negotiate a teacher evaluation process if they wish, consistent with the criteria that are set forth in the law. If they do not agree on a process, then a process developed by the commissioner in consultation with a large group that includes everyone from Education Minnesota to the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce would then be binding. And that is is anticipated how it would work. Either it gets negotiated based on the criteria, or it's the commissioner's plan, again, based upon the criteria. So I think those are some of the interesting policy provisions that are in the bill. There are others. The list you have, and there are some other little ones. I shouldn't say that. So everything was important to somebody, whether you're a community education director or a ninth grade student who wants to participate in PSU. But there you have it. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer. And I believe now Tom Melcher, who you've all been waiting for.
Morning. Great to be here today. It's great to be back on the job after the shutdown. I think in the end we aside from the 60/40 payment thing, we ended up with a pretty good bill for public education, at least in terms of the funding levels that are in the bill. You should all have several different sheets of paper from me. You've got a kind of a narrative summary of the bill that I'm not going to go through in detail, but it has more information than what I'm going to be talking about today, including names of contact people if you have questions. That'll also be posted on the department website. There is a district-by-district run that I'll say a little bit about. It just has kind of bottom line numbers for fiscal 12 and fiscal 13, so you can see kind of at a glance what the bottom line impacts are on each school district and charter school in the state. One of the things that you will note about this, which is very different from the conference committee report, is that all the numbers on here are positive. That there was a kind of a sense of a uniform increase for all school districts, and some districts got more, but we don't have anybody losing $150, $200 per pupil like we had in the original bill. So from a funding perspective, we're looking at significant increases for school districts across the state. Then I have a kind of one-page summary sheet that looks at state appropriations, and this is pretty much the sheet we were operating off of during the negotiations between the governor and the legislature as we were meeting behind closed doors, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that process. And then I've got the PowerPoint, which is a copy of what I'll be using here today. So let me just start walking through the PowerPoint. I'm happy to answer questions as we go, or at the end as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the governor and the legislative positions on E-12 funding as we went into this special session. I'll talk about the funding changes that are in the bill, including the shifts, the impact on school revenue, how the uses of revenue change, and some other related changes. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about levy timelines. So, toward the end of the shutdown, there was the leadership agreement that Valerie talked about. And from a K-12 funding perspective, we went into the negotiations between the governor and the legislature with some kind of parameters pretty well defined for us. They had already agreed on a 60/40 payment shift. That was a done deal going into the negotiations. They had agreed to $50 on the formula each year, but they hadn't agreed as to whether that would be linked or delinked in terms of compensatory and sparsity funding, transportation sparsity growing with inflation. They had agreed to a $132 million spending increase over the base budget, which was in between the governor's position and the legislative position. They'd agreed to a zero levy target for schools. And they had agreed that policy proposals from the June 29th offer from the Republicans were off the table unless they were mutually agreed to, but there was a lot of kind of backsliding on that in terms of what was really a policy change as opposed to a reform. So basically all the stuff ended up being on the table in the discussions. And a lot of the negotiating back and forth had to do with the Republicans pushing for more of their policy things to be in the bill. In fact, they wouldn't even talk about the money until there was some discussion of the policy stuff. And the governor pretty much trying to maintain status quo in terms of some of the provisions and avoid major redistributions of funding among school districts. So the governor's position going into this set of negotiations at the end of the session included the $50 on the formula each year, which he had proposed back in May, and he was very strongly committed to maintaining the linkage between the formula and compensatory revenue, along with sparsity revenue, transportation sparsity, and so forth. He was very committed to maintaining the special education growth factor at the current law levels. He did not want to see any cuts to the special education budget. He was committed to maintaining integration funding based on its current levels of funding, or at least avoiding major redistributions of money among districts. He was strongly supportive of funding for early childhood education, including the quality rating system. He was interested in providing funding for student performance, and in the governor's view of things, we should base the performance funding on growth that students achieve as opposed to proficiency, and it should be based on all grade levels, and reading and math, not just third grade reading. And he was kind of above everything else really interested in providing stable funding for all districts and avoiding big winners and losers in the allocation of funding. The legislative position going in, coming out of the conference report, had been also an increase in the formula allowance. The conference report had included a $20 and $21 increase, dealing. Also a reduction in the special education growth factor. The original bill enacted by the conference committee was a 2% increase in special ed per year rather than 4.6% in current law. And as we went through the negotiations, one of the early proposals from the Republicans was to split the difference and go to 3.3% on special education growth, and the governor was holding firm, saying, no, we've got to maintain special ed funding, we don't want any cut in special ed funding. Integration funding, the Republican plan would have eliminated it in the current biennium, moved to some transition revenue going forward, and using some of that money to fund their literacy initiative. They also were interested in scholarships or vouchers, depending on how you like to phrase those, and they wanted to do those at 3 levels. Preschool with early childhood scholarships, K-12 for students in low-performing schools in cities of the first class, and then for students who graduate early. So there were kind of 3 categories of essentially providing vouchers or scholarships, and 2 of the 3, the K-12 piece and the early graduation piece, would take money out of school districts and then put it to the use of the individuals for scholarships. They also were interested in funding based on student performance, but they were very narrowly focused on grade 3 reading, and wanted to look at both proficiency and growth. And they wanted to increase funding for small schools, although the small schools funding was not part of the conference committee report. That was part of the House bill. And then with the additional money put in the target, that was one of their priorities for use of the additional money. And then also to increase compensatory funding for large suburban districts that don't benefit very much from the sliding scale compensatory formula. Again, something that was in the House bill that they didn't have money for in the conference report, but when there was more money on the table, that they were interested in adding as a use of the new money. So that was kind of where we were at on that Friday, the first day of the negotiations between the governor and the legislature. And so we kind of worked our way down this kind of a spreadsheet. And as you can see, basically, we ended up taking the governor's position on the formula, $50 per year linked. We ended up doing a kind of a compromise on the small schools and the compensatory pilot grants, really quite similar to what had been in the House bill originally, except that the small schools piece was modified to eliminate the charter schools from participating in that. Compensatory pilot grant formula was modified a little bit too, and it was moved to the second year instead of the first year. The House bill had put that in the first year. They snuck in a compensatory pilot grant to the Albert Lee district. They were just burned in for $150,000. I kind of suspected that was due to the close election that they had down there. Some impact there. eliminating T and E, which was part of the